Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm Alex here as always to talk about the final 53-man roster and my prediction for the Chargers, as well as get into some of the preseason storylines that we'll be watching against San Francisco tonight. I will be watching it tomorrow morning because 7 p.m. PT is past my bedtime. But I will be watching that game and having takeaways, and I know Steven and Tyler will be doing the podcast tomorrow after, the morning after the final preseason game and getting into some of their final thoughts and, eventually their 53-man roster predictions on the Tuesday show. And I think there are live reaction to some of the final 53-man roster predictions on the Chargers channel. But I wanted to do my own, 53-man roster prediction, and I've calculated the numbers. I made sure that I had 53 players before I started recording. So yeah, I guess we'll just jump right into it, and I'll go position by position and tell you guys what I think about this final roster that I've made. Again, I should say this is what I think the Chargers will do, not what I would do if I was Chargers GM, right? But just based on all of the information we have, what I think the Chargers will do. Let's jump into the first conversational minefield. Justin Herbert, Easton Stick, and Max Duggan. I do believe all three will be rostered. Now, Justin Herbert and Easton Stick I don't think are exactly controversial, but Duggan is the QB3 talking point. Brandon Staley did say yesterday that every year is a new year when it came to talking about keeping three quarterbacks versus keeping two. So to some extent, it is possible that the Chargers decide to keep two despite the new rule. That being said, they spent a 7th round pick on Duggan, as opposed to letting him hit undrafted free agency. And Tom Telesco, in 8 of his 10 years as GM, has kept 3 quarterbacks. And even if you remove all 4 of the Easton Stick QB3 seasons before he was promoted to QB2, he still kept 3 in 4 out of the 6 seasons, the exceptions being Rivers and Geno Smith and Rivers and Kellen Clemens, I think in 2 of those years. But I just think with Duggan, they like doing the scout team quarterback thing, and I think they eventually kind of want to develop him as well. Now, can we be having a very different conversation about this quarterback position 24 hours from now if Easton Stick plays the entirety of the Niners game and Max Duggan sits on the bench? Yes. If that happens, then I would almost reverse this 53-man roster prediction, whatever term you want to use. But until then, I kind of am of the belief that yes, they do keep 3 quarterbacks on the roster, just leaning on history, leaning on everything that we know, leaning on the fact that the new emergency quarterback rule, for those that don't know how that works, would inactivate Max Duggan on game day, so they have an extra practice squad promotion. So while it would affect the final 53-man roster, it would not affect game days. And so that, change only emboldens their philosophy to keep 3 quarterbacks. I would not be stunned if Duggan was cut. I do think some red flags in that situation are being raised after not playing him in the last preseason game. But for me, I do think, there's this like conversation about the waiver wire, and I'll get into it a little bit later as well, where it's like, oh, well, if they cut Duggan, will somebody like pick him up? Will somebody not pick him up? No, probably no one would pick him up and let him go to the practice squad. But like, they kept Easton Stick last year, and would anyone have been dying to like pick Easton Stick up as their QB2 or QB3 last year on the waiver wire? I don't think so. And yet they still kept Easton Stick and have kept Easton Stick as the, QB3 on this team for many, many years. So, with the same GM, same philosophy in place, unless they're really dying to put Elijah Dotson on the roster, which they could be, or, Mark Webb or any of these final like 53-man guy candidates, which I could see. I just think that, leaning on history, leaning on how the Chargers have done things, Duggan makes the roster. They spent a draft pick on him. I think if he was an undrafted free agent for them, it would be a little bit murkier. But for the time being, I am taking Max Duggan as the 3rd quarterback spot, just based on how the Chargers have rolled and based on everything we know about them, despite Brandon Staley's quote of trying to play it coy of keeping 3 or 2 quarterbacks. And like I said, I think the new rule only kind of emboldens their philosophy. My running backs, I have Austin Ekeler, I have Joshua Kelly, and Isaiah Spiller. Kind of because I kept Max Duggan, I do not have Elijah Dotson. This is an interesting spot because I think you can make the argument that Elijah Dotson will be, I mean, he's certainly going to be on the practice squad if he does not make the roster. I just don't think he has as much utility on the final roster as somebody like Larry Roundtree in previous seasons. Larry Roundtree made the final roster last year as the fourth running back, kind of because of his special teams value with Brian Ficken. Eventually was cut during the season, but then promoted on the practice squad quite a few times because of his special teams value. I think Dotson has played some special teams, but he doesn't, I don't think he's as trusted in terms of what Ficken thinks of him, to the point where they would place him on the 53-man roster as that fourth body every week. Because again, if you carry a fourth running back, it's less like what that guy can do like on the field on offense and more what he can do in the margins on special teams, right? And I think that's why the Chargers did keep somebody like Roundtree last year, even though that confounded a lot of people and confused a lot of people. So for me, I think Dotson had a tremendous opening game. Last week was a little rougher with 6 carries for 21 yards and had the 2 big drops on the last drive. But I think honestly, it's less about his preseason performance and more just about roster construction here. I think he could be promoted from the practice squad game in a few games because of injury, or maybe because he gets better at special teams throughout the year and the Chargers decide they want that body. But at the same time, right now, I'm kind of going to sell the Elijah Dotson final roster hype only because I think they need help at a few other spots. And I think that there's a few other contributors that can contribute to special teams more, which is important to how this team constructs their roster now. Wide receiver, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Quentin Johnston, Josh Palmer, Darius Davis, and then the 6th spot. The 6th spot obviously gaining kind of the most conversation. Right now I have that being Jalen Guyton. Jalen Guyton did get on the field before the New Orleans game and did some workouts with the other wide receivers in the room. So I think that's worth pointing out just as we talk about what the Chargers are going to do here going forward. I think you could see a PUP activation or taken off of PUP in the couple next coming days with Guyton. But, there's also still the possibility that Tuesday comes and he remains on the PUP list and is out for the first 4 games as a result. So I've kind of asterisked Jalen Guyton because of the uncertainty and the fact that we don't know. Because by the time this video uploads, Jalen Guyton could be off of PUP. By the time Monday comes, Jalen Guyton could be off of PUP. And then, he may still be on PUP by the time Tuesday comes. So the uncertainty, we don't know. So what happens if Jalen Guyton is on the final roster? I would still say right now that the replacement would be John Hightower. Now, I was wrong, and Tyler was wrong, and Steven were wrong, and we were all wrong last year when we decided to say that Hightower, once they signed, would be the Jalen Guyton replacement. They, never really showed interest in elevating him to the final active game day roster and using him in a Jalen Guyton-like capacity. But I feel like, again, with a year in the system, the fact that their skill sets are comparable, the fact that he had the training camp period that he did, I think that he would get the call up as that 6th wide receiver. Now, the preseason game was rough. He did miss the first preseason game because he was injured last week. And then, the second preseason game, I didn't think he played well. Again, he, I think, had 1 reception for 10 yards. And then, there were 2 routes that I didn't think he ran particularly well. And Easton Stick kind of threw it to where he was supposed to be and he wasn't there. But again, like the intermediate routes are not John Hightower's thing. Like that's not his skill set. And the, opportunities that Easton Stick wanted to throw the ball deep to John Hightower and Kellen Moore wanted to dial that up, the Chargers offensive line just didn't pass protect very well. And Brandon Staley talked about that after the game. They just didn't do well in a pass protection sense and left Easton Stick out to dry, which if you're going to, throw the ball downfield to John Hightower, that kind of destroys that possibility, right? You can't really do that with Hightower and use him as that weapon, assuming the offensive line isn't good. So I assume, again, with the starting offensive line in place that we're going to see in the regular season being much better than the one we see in the preseason every week, I do still think Hightower is the quasi 6th, 7th receiver, depending on what happens with Jalen Guyton on the PUP list. So if Jalen Guyton does go on the PUP list, I do believe John Hightower will make the roster. But as of now, I'm going to predict that Jalen Guyton comes off of the PUP list at some points just because we have heard about him making some improvements and progress in his recovery. Tight ends. Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, Trey McKitty, and Stone Smart. I do have Stone Smart on my final 53-man roster, and it was somebody that we also predicted on the final 53-man roster 2 months ago. Stone Smart is working with the first team punt unit, which is a huge thing to consider when it comes to special teams. And I also believe that the Chargers don't know what they're going to do with Trey McKitty. Brandon Staley has not minced his words when it's come to Trey McKitty and what the future holds for him on the Chargers. So I'm just kind of the belief that right now, if assuming he makes the final roster, I wouldn't be shocked if he gets cut after and like they sign like an OJ Howard or they sign a Steven Anderson or something like that. I still believe Stone Smart will be on the final team because I think they want another body there anyway, because I don't think they fully trust Trey McKitty right now, and that's pretty obvious. But aside from that, I think that, McKitty's status on the final roster is kind of up in the air based on the move that the Chargers make. Maybe they see someone get cut on the waiver wire and go in that direction. But I do think that, they want to keep 4 tight ends because I think of because of the Kellen Moore blocking scheme, one, but I think also because of some of the uncertainty that lies in this room in terms of what this actually will end up looking like by week 1 or week 2, depending on what they decide to do, maybe in the tight end free agent market. And I think Stone Smart, again, is playing a really valuable role on special teams, which is more than you can say for somebody like Elijah Dotson, as good as he has been as a runner. So that's kind of why I went with Stone Smart over Dotson as a choice between those two. Offensive line. Steven, if you're listening, hello. Rashawn Slater, Zion Johnson, Corey Linsley, Jamari Sallier, and Trey Pipkins from left to right on the offensive line. Those are your starters. Pretty simple to explain there. After that, I have Foster Sarell, Zach Bailey, Will Clapp, and Jordan McFadden. When we did this roster prediction 2 months ago, I actually had Brendan Jaimez over Zach Bailey, and we made that roster mistake. I think that Zach Bailey has played really well this preseason. He's gotten a lot of hype throughout this training camp period, and he's backed it up in the preseason games. He's had 80-plus pass blocking and run blocking games, and has allowed 1 pressure in each game. He's easily been the best part of like the backup offensive line. Again, maybe not saying a lot when Foster Sarell and Austin Pleasance are there and committing war crimes. But Zach Bailey just has been really good on his own. And I think the fact that he has the flexibility to be your right tackle, to be your right guard, to kick inside as well. I just think that makes him stand out over somebody like Brendan Jaimez. I know Jaimez did play center, in this preseason coming over from guard, but he doesn't have that tackle flexibility that Zach Bailey does. And I'm honestly, if I'm the Chargers, I get Zach Bailey in some of those right tackle reps in this Niners game because I'm not comfortable with what I'm seeing from Foster Sarell and Austin Pleasance in that experience, in that swing tackle competition, if you want to use that word lightly. So I'd like to see Zach Bailey get some reps at his natural position because we've already seen that he can be a pretty competent guard in the preseason. So let's see something else. Fullback, Xander Horvath. Pretty simple. Chargers didn't bring in any competition for him. I guess you could argue, again, this is one of those spots they can cut if they prefer to keep Elijah Dotson or a Mark Webb, a fifth safety, another corner, whomever it might be, if they want that extra roster spot and they want to keep Duggan. Horvath is like a sacrifice spot, but I do still think he'll have a pretty important role in this offense as a blocker, especially considering the state of the tight end room right now. And so for that reason, I still keep him on the roster. And this isn't like a Bobby Holly, Gabe Neighbors situation where they brought in a guy to compete with him either. He's essentially just been in that spot the entire preseason. So I think I would have more of a fear that he wasn't on the roster or a feeling that he wasn't on the roster if they had done that. But they didn't. Edge, Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Chris Rumph, Tuli. I think I spelled Tuli too wrong there. I'm not sure if I spelled it right or wrong. But Edge, pretty self-explanatory. I will give shout outs to Andrew Farmer as well as Carlo Kemp, who I think played really, really well this preseason and I think deserve spots on that practice squad, especially with, how often Joey Bosa has gotten hurt, Khalil Mack's injury history as well. although he was healthy last year. I would keep those guys around, or try to keep those guys around as much as I can, just because, again, I do think they showed that intensity and that bend this preseason that kind of really separated them in terms of the pass rushing and the speed that they have on the outside. So, the 4 starters are, or the, 2 starters and 2 rotation players are pretty simple though, in terms of Bosa and Mack. Hopefully both of those guys stay healthy this year, and Tuli and Rumph in some order behind them. I have been impressed with what I've seen from Rumph this preseason, but again, just kind of one thing where it's like I saw it from Rumph last preseason too, and it didn't quite translate when the time came for it to translate. So, hoping for the best for him. Defensive line. I do have this. Let me just open my roster real quick. If you scroll all the way, the pup probable that we came up with 2 months ago was Otito Ogbonnia, just based on everything we were hearing. And it sounds honestly like Otito Ogbonnia is going to remain on pup, unlike Guyton and Johnson has come off of pup, and it seems like Guyton is prepared to come off of pup very soon. So from that standpoint, I would just say that, like, when we're talking about those positions, it does feel like Otito will miss the first 4 games and potentially evaluate his return date later. He was one of the later injuries too. I think it was like November 14th. I don't remember exactly which game that was off the top of my head, but it was one of the later season ending injuries. And he did suffer that same torn patella tendon that JC Jackson suffered earlier, right? So ultimately, I have him starting the season on pup. Johnson is off the pup list, so I do think we can project at this point that he'll start week 1, or at least that's the hope. Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, Morgan Fox, Scott Matlock, Nick Williams, and this is the final spot, the 6th spot with Otito out. I give it to Chris Hinton. I think this will be like a Chris Hinton versus Gerard Clark debate for that final nose tackle spot. I think ultimately Hinton has had more time in the system, given how he finished last year and showed some flashes in some regular season action. And I think he's kind of been more refined and better throughout this training camp and preseason period. I do think you're really impressed with the motor on somebody like Gerard Clark and just the effort and tenacity he shows each play. But I think he's kind of a year away type of player. I think they want to draft and stash him. Alex Katzen talked about him when we did our initial 53-man roster prediction. I think he said that he was a guy that just kind of like needs to fill his build a little bit, and just correct a couple things just about his technique. I think that he's kind of in the position that maybe like Fehoko was in 2020, where it's like, all right, let's see what you are next year, right? So for me, I went with Hinton just because, again, he's had 3 pressures, 3 run stops this preseason, has been pretty solid. And I think showed you some of those flashes towards the end of last season. And I think that holds water with the coaching staff on the defensive line. They, do like Hinton a lot. Coach Ed has raved about Hinton a lot. So, I mean, honestly, I think that he gets that final spot while Otito is out. After that, who knows? Linebacker, Eric Kendricks, Kenneth Murray, Dayon Henley, Nick Niemann, Amon Bongbemiga. Pretty simple there. I do think that they go with 5 linebackers. Not much to debate. There's not another linebacker who I think could like steal a spot here. I have been really impressed by Dayon in the preseason, so I hope he gets some more time to play, and just, continues to show what he can show. Because he was really impressive against the Saints, led the team in tackles. That sack he had in the backfield where he just like blew right by and shot the gap. Fun stuff to watch from him. Cornerback, Michael Davis. I have JC Jackson in red because when we made this roster, we didn't know whether he was going to be able to play. It seems like, although it's not confirmed, he will start week 1. Michael Davis and JC Jackson as your starting outside corners. Asante Samuel Jr. as your starting slot. Ja Taylor and Dean Leonard as the other corners on the roster. We did talk about maybe keeping Keemon Hall at the time that we made this roster, just because he's been a pretty pivotal special teams player for the Chargers over the years. But obviously he was waived with the injury designation and the injury settlement that the Chargers recently came up with yesterday, because he reverted to IR, but now he's back off the team because they reached the injury settlement with him. So yeah, I think that would be a place where I could see them keeping 6 corners, but now it's like Cam Brown has been good this preseason, but again, I think it's mostly practice squad fodder at that point. Safety, Derwin James, Alohi Gilman, JT Woods, Raheem Lane. This is a place where, again, if you take Duggan off, I could see the Chargers plugging in Mark Webb there. They have gone with 10 DBs historically under Staley, so it wouldn't shock me if they went with Mark Webb here. For the time being, I'm not going to predict it. But, that's a name to keep in mind, I think. If I do get one or two, picks on this wrong, I think it would be because they cut Max Duggan and because they keep an Elijah Dotson or a Mark Webb, maybe instead. But I feel pretty confident about these picks in general. I'm hoping, I guess we'll get to this when we talk about the Niners game. I was going to say, I hope we see more from Raheem Lane tonight. He's been solid this preseason, but we'll get to that when we talk about the Niners game. Special teams, Dicker, Harris, Scott. Pretty obvious. I think when we talked about this, there was a bit more to the concept that there was this actual kicker competition when it came to Dicker and Hopkins. But at this point, Hopkins has not been able to stay consistently healthy through the preseason. He's been missing some field goals short in practice, which again, not a good sign for a guy who had a hamstring injury last year and just continuously has kind of had these lower body issues. So for, he's also older, he's 32. I think they go with Cam Dicker here pretty easily. He's been 62 of 68, I think, on field goals in camp. He's kicking 92%, which I think gets you really excited as a Chargers fan. Maybe who knows if that translates to the regular season over a full sample size this year, but he was really effective. He's really young, and just ultimately kind of poses less problems for the Chargers here. I do wish Dustin Hopkins got a chance to push him, to winning that job. But ultimately Dicker has been really good. So that is my 53-man final roster prediction. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments below. And I guess we'll find out how right or wrong I was. But again, the real inflection point for this roster is what they decide to do with Duggan, and then kind of what they decide to do down the roster, because again, that opens up one spot, or, potentially two spots, I guess, if they decide to cut Horvath, if they decide to, cut Stone Smart, right? So there's a couple things that I think can change here, but all in all, I do think this is kind of the final roster. So I'll just give one more rundown. Quarterback, Herbert, Stick, Duggan. Running back, Eckler, Kelly, Spiller. Wide receiver, Allen, Williams, Johnston, Palmer, Davis, Guyton, with the Hightower asterisk there, depending on how Jalen Guyton stays on PUP. Everett, Parham, McKitty, and Stone Smart at tight end. Offensive line, Slater, Zion, Corey Linsley, Jamari Salyer, Trey Pipkins, Foster Sorrell, Zach Bailey, Will Clapp, and Jordan McFadden. Fullback, Horvath. Edge, Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Chris Rumph, Tooley. Defensive line, Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, Morgan Fox, Scott Matlock, Nick Williams, Chris Hinton. Linebacker, Eric Kendricks, Kenneth Murray, Dayon Henley, Nick Neiman, Eamon Ogbongbemiga. Cornerback, Michael Davis, J.C. Jackson, Asante Samuel Jr., Jot Taylor, Dean Leonard. Safety, Derwin James, Alohi Gilman, J.T. Woods, and Raheem Lane. And special teams, Dicker, Harris, and Scott. Like I said, so those are my 53-man Chargers roster. So let's see how it ages in a couple days. Could age terribly. Let's talk a little bit about the Niners game now and just some of the things that I'm excited to see in this one. I think first I kind of do want to see Duggan. I know we didn't get the chance to see him last preseason game, but it's this can kind of make a big, move here to whether he makes the roster or not. Like I said, if he does not play in this preseason game, then I think the discussion starts to ratchet up as to whether the Chargers are seriously considering keeping two quarterbacks. If he does, I think it's more or less the status quo, depending on how Duggan plays, I guess. But I still expect them to keep three at this point. But again, I think Duggan does kind of need to show something. Again, it's kind of unfair because in the first preseason game, the offensive line was just awful, and I felt bad for Duggan while watching him. But, I do think the coaching staff would like to see something from him. This is the last chance for Elijah Dotson, to kind of make that final roster push, like we said. I think if he has a game like his first game, that will certainly change some of the discussions and turn some heads. Still for me, though, I think Dotson's been getting more active in the special teams since Larry Roundtree got cut, but I don't think he quite has that thin stamp of approval yet. So I'll be curious to see, looking at special teams maybe after the game is over, how many snaps he got. And just kind of what his role there was, because that could point to whether he would make the roster as a fourth running back or something like that, or hit the practice squad, right? Because that's kind of what I talked about with Stone Smart a little bit earlier. Stone Smart, again, another player I'm looking forward to watching. Had a great week last week. Had the block that led to the Easton Stick touchdown. Had the acrobatic catch in traffic, which was, really fun to see. 4 receptions for 32 yards, I think. So, yeah, really excited to see what Stone Smart does tonight. Trey McKitty and Donald Parham need to play too, and I need to see something from them because I'm going crazy about this tight end room. If it is to remain like it's currently constructed, that would be unfortunate. So, yeah, want to see something from Stone Smart and Trey McKitty and really the whole tight end room because, again, past Gerald Everett, don't think it's the deepest group, certainly from a blocking standpoint as it currently stands. CJ Okoye. CJ Okoye, this is the last chance we'll probably get to see him. So for those who don't know how the International Player Program works, Okoye is pretty much guaranteed to be on the practice squad. He would be an extra member of the practice squad given the International Player Program designation. So the Chargers essentially would have 17 practice squad players as opposed to 16. That's kind of why Okoye wouldn't make a push for the roster anyway. I know some people have talked about him on the 53, but it really wouldn't make sense to do. Again, I think kind of like we talked about with Gerard Clark, he's a stash and develop prospect, and I would expect to see probably both those guys on the practice squad, especially given that Okoye does hold that designation as the extra practice squad spot by the International Player Program. So excited to see what he does tonight in his final game, though, that we're going to see probably from him for a while. And just see again him, the fact that this is his first time playing football is just something that baffles me every week. He had a pressure last week, I think he had, one pressure, 2 run stops and a tackle. It's like this guy is just kind of insane. It's insane that this is his first time like playing football, and the fact that he's just able to get in the backfield so easily and wreak havoc. Again, still an incredibly raw player, but we've seen that he's a toolsy player so far, and he has some legit pop to his athleticism to use. So I'll be curious to see kind of what he develops into in future seasons, and hope we get another good CJ Okoye game tonight where he makes some highlight plays. Just trying to think of some other Chargers off of the top of my head. I'm curious to see what we see from John Hightower. I know we just talked about John Hightower kind of having the bad game last week, and I forgot to mention this, but like you can mention Keelan Doss being the more consistent player throughout the preseason. The only thing that I'll say about that is like, yes, he's been the more consistent player throughout the preseason to some extent, but he just doesn't replace the skill set that Jalen Guyton has. He's not a 4-4, guy that, he's not slow, but again, you're not asking for consistency when it comes to replacing Guyton. You're asking for that variability and that degree of athleticism. So that is kind of the distinction I would make, being the potential Jalen Guyton replacement if he cannot go, right? Like that still, I do think he has to show something in this preseason, and I'm curious to see if the offensive line maybe plays a little bit better tonight, if Stick or Duggan can unload, a deep shot to him and finally get him a big play in a preseason game. Obviously did not get to play week 1 and kind of struggled last week, like I said. Raheem Layne, another guy that I'm excited to watch tonight. I think JT Woods will probably get a more extended rest period. I think he'll play some tonight, but I think they're largely going to give Raheem Layne and Mark Webb the chance for those reps. And, with Layne, he's been really solid on special teams, and that's probably going to be his role when the season starts. But I'll just be curious to see if he gets a couple balls thrown his way, what he does in coverage, what he's like as a tackler. Again, continuing to build his skill set and all those things, and maybe make a push for a higher safety position on this roster, down the road, right? So that's all I'm hoping to see from Raheem Layne, I think, in this one. And, just as a whole, I'm really excited for the, final preseason game tonight. I'm probably not going to watch it tonight. 10 p.m. Eastern time for the game to start, to me watching 2 or 3 quarters of Duggan ball. It's a little bit of a tough sell, I'm not going to lie, but I can't really wreck my sleep schedule in medical school. I'm already, as you can see from the stress acne on my face, dealing with a lot. So I think I will want to get some sleep tonight and watch the game maybe in the morning. But yeah, so that's kind of it for me today. Let me know what you guys think about my final 53-man roster prediction and the Niners game down in the comments below. Steven and Tyler, again, will be live on Saturday to talk the preseason game, and maybe watch out for a little Steven Tyler Alex crossover next week. Maybe watch out for that. We will be doing our NFL season picks. We'll be picking all the award winners, all the division winners, all the playoff winners, and the Super Bowl champions. So we'll be doing that episode the 31st next week, I think Steven said. So keep a lookout for that. If you've watched to the end of the video, you get that little nugget. But as always, have fun tonight if anyone's going to the game or if anyone's going to watch the game. And Baltimore